If we lose all that we know of as nature, where does that leave us psychologically and physically, where we know that we need nature to provide us with a greater sense of ability and health? So in order to save nature, we have to really get in tune with it.
Is it possible to feel like you are genuinely rooted in nature while living in the middle of suburbia? That was the hypothesis architects Matthew and Maria Salenger set out to test, and they used their 1950s suburban tract home on Cedar Street as the test grounds.
When I grew up on Maui, a lot of my friends lived in houses that had, big expanses of glass that were looking into gardens or the ocean or something like that. And when I moved here, and almost all of the houses, they had these small punched windows. There really didn't feel like there was any connection between the inside and the outside. Most of the houses were just concrete blocks with these little punched windows, and Maria and I wanted to figure out a way that we could commune with nature in a really profound way that wasn't overly contrived, but was something that would create a connection between nature and our living style. When we bought this property, it's a 1/4 acre, and the house from 1953 that's behind me was pushed up pretty far to the front of the buildable area of the lot. And there was this big backyard, and we didn't know what to do with it.
What they did was embark on a study of sorts. A study that would span several years and evolve into something much larger than either likely imagined. As they began to reimagine the way one could live in suburbia, they unearthed learnings in passive and biophilic design, planet-positive design, modularity and flexibility, and even building with reuse in mind.
Both of us wanted to have some kind of connection with nature in that same sense. So the backyard became something that we said, this is where we want to live. We actually want to live as much as we can outside in the backyard, but you need, shelter to sleep in and potentially air conditioning and whatnot. And so we built 2 individual bedroom pods that were in the back. They consisted of 3 portions, 3 10-foot lengths. The whole structure width was 6'8". So there was a portion that was enclosed and air conditioned, and that was the bedroom. So that was the first 10 feet. The middle 10 feet was where you entered up into a patio, was open to the sky. And then the third last end was 10 foot of garden. The idea was you wake up and you are within a 30-foot long space with a garden on one end and the bedroom on the other. And essentially the bedroom is completely enclosed. The middle section is open to the sky, and the garden section was open to the ground and the sky, but otherwise completely voiding out all of the view around the space. So because the overall structural height was about 8 feet, and we clad that with corrugated translucent fiberglass. So there was light, coming through, but not any kind of view to the outside. So it didn't matter that we were in the middle of suburbia. It felt like you were in the middle of nowhere. You could have picked that up and put it out in the middle of the desert, and you would have had, another amazing kind of expression of having that really intimate relationship with nature within your bedroom, essentially. We wanted to make sure that we maintained the backyard as a way to kind of commune with the nature. And the grass there too was useful, much in the same way that when we did this renovation in 2010, the grass helps cool the bedroom. So the pods that were out in the backyard were lifted off the ground about 2 feet. And there was a floor hatch that you could open, and then a clerestory window in the bedroom that you could open so that you would get cool air coming off the grass and up through the space and then ejecting the hot air. There was also a really small little window unit air conditioner in each of the 2 pods too, but a lot of the nights we didn't need it. So anyway, that aspect of waking up, communing with a little garden and the sky, walking into the house over the grass before getting into the house was, you know, I don't know how radical that was, but it was certainly something that was different than all the other houses that I had seen in Arizona. And I wanted to make sure that we had something that was interesting like that you had to really feel the weather, you know, on your way in and out of the bedroom. And I felt a lot better about sleeping outside and having the breeze, actually feeling that breeze come through, because in Hawaii, where we grew up, there was no air conditioning. Now everybody has air conditioning there, but in, you know, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s and whatnot, you had to live by the trade winds there. And so you would have these jalousie windows and things like that would allow the air to go through both sides of a room so that you would always feel that breeze and get cooled. And that's what I was trying to do with the hatch, the floor hatch and the high window. And the same way here, where these doors behind me, you know, with the lawn behind me, the idea was that we have these operable windows in the clerestory that's up at the ceiling with a 12-foot high ceiling, and we can open those windows and open up the doors, and you get this cool air off the grass and through the house.
Those pods served them for several years, but when their family of two and the architecture studio they operated from their home started to expand, they knew it was time to revisit their study. And many of the learnings, materials, and even the structure of the pods were incorporated into the redesign. But one thing they hadn't anticipated was the challenge of getting two design minds to come together on a definitive direction. So they turned to a quasi-integrative design approach.
Maria and I could not agree on a design. And for a year, we would, you know, battle it out about like, how are we really going to design this? Because there was a weighing of, okay, well, resale value is important, but doing something really for, you know, for us and showing what we want to, how we want architecture to be is important too. But they were at odds, seemingly. So what we decided to do was actually put together a survey, 2 different surveys where we gave them questions and asked them on a scale of 1 to 10, how important are these kinds of spaces to you? So one of them was really very straightforward, like, how important is a garage? How important is a master closet? Do you prefer a great room over, separated rooms, et cetera? And then there was another portion that was less specific. And we asked, if resale value wasn't an option or wasn't an issue, what would you want your house to contain? And that question was amazing because we had about 40 people answered our survey, and 32 of them used the word atrium or courtyard without us prompting that ever. And so the number 1 item was the atrium or courtyard. Number 2 was a great room. And then number 3 was a garage, which we didn't want a garage. We didn't believe in needing a garage. But because it was number 3 on the list, we put in a garage. But that's how we designed the house. It became really easy. It was that, okay, courtyard, great room, and then, a garage on the side of that building. And it was like we designed it in like half an hour once we got the surveys back. And a month later, we submitted for a permit. So there was something we knew, about the gravitas of the courtyard. I grew up in a Chinese courtyard house, and that had all of these biophilic principles in it as well. And a lot of what we designed here was actually based around that house. It is a very comfortable space to be in when it's protected on all sides. And one of our friends, who's not architecturally related at all, he walked in through the main entry in the corner of the courtyard, and he said, "Man, you guys tapped into some kind of vortex here, this like an energy vortex. It just feels really, really good." And this, again, was all before I knew about biophilic design. But we knew that it was something that was going to work. When we started having people over, and the way people reacted was amazing. And it was only once all of the glass was in, it just felt so good to be, to have that enclosure. Feel like you're safe. You feel like you're protected, and you really have your own kind of universe at a certain point.
Surprisingly, that universe they designed for themselves is now 15 years old. And that is quite a track record, given that most homes in the U.S. are renovated every 3 to 5 years. an interval that certainly contributes to the construction and demolition waste, making up 30 to 40% of global waste. And though a few of the materials are nearing end of life, the design still feels incredibly timeless yet contemporary. How is this? It's likely from the emphasis on nature, designing for flexibility and adaptability, and to borrow from brutalism, honesty of materials, using things like concrete, glass, and steel in their raw, unadorned nature.
From 2000, when we bought the property, to 2009, we found that we kept having to change the house to deal with what, our living situation was. And it seemed like it was just constantly changing based on having employees, for instance, or having consultants coming over, or our son getting older. So when we designed this house, we were very conscious about every decision being flexible, like everything was flexible. So part of that was that what the patio that we're sitting on now, the height of it, the elevation of it is the same as the original house. And so this whole courtyard surround is all at the same level. It's all at seating level so that you can sit around the garden when we're having parties or, kids are playing in the lawn or whatnot. But also it makes it really easy to move furniture around. And a lot of the moving furniture that we have in the house is meant for that same kind of sense of flexibility, but for the inside. We have these huge millwork pieces that are on casters that you can move around so that in the great room, for instance, we can push it all the way to the back of the building and then have a huge space for a long table where we can have 60 people eating at the same time at a table, for instance. And on the other side, there are 4 big cabinets that are closets, essentially, that are on casters that can move around, and they have a big rolling kind of door that goes with the cabinet, and you can configure them all kinds of different ways in that space so that we can have up to 4 bedrooms in there, plus a kind of playroom, family room. So there's all kinds of different things that we thought about with the flexibility. And interestingly, the pods were always meant that way too, where you could unbolt each of the 10-foot sections into 3 parts and then ship them somewhere else, and that was always the goal. But what we ended up doing instead was dismantling them, except for the 10-foot by 6'8" frames. And on that side, there's all 6 of the frames were just reused. And that was really neat because the frames themselves, like I said, we meant that we could sell the pods or we could move them somewhere. And instead we utilized all of the parts because the main front door that we have into the courtyard was our bedroom door for 6 years. That was inside one of the pods. All of the decking that's in the frames on the south side are all reused tracks from the pods and the deck that we had. So all of this stuff is all about flexibility that way. Everything we did was trying to be flexible as much as we could. Variability of the spaces and being able to move these things around, it's not really anything specific in biophilic design as a pattern per se, but having a surprise, in a familiar place is something that's enjoyable to people, and Kellert mentions that, but that is something that's really fun. And as a kid, right, you knew to rearrange your space was something that was really exciting and fun to do. Everybody feels that way, so it's definitely another one of those patterns. Having agency, and that little kids love to have that, agency. And that, again, that's something that we all want in our lives, right? So it's definitely something that's biophilic in the end.
Though Matthew points out many of the biophilic principles of the design, at the time when they were designing the residence, he had yet to discover the practice of biophilia. He and Maria were simply implementing design choices that would deepen the connection to nature. While these interventions were intentional and strategic, many of them came somewhat innately, but it was through the process of designing Cedar Street, and at the urging of colleague and friend Sonia Bocart, a prominent thought leader in biophilia, that prompted Matthew to dive deep into the rabbit hole of biophilic design.
There's a friend of mine named Sonia Bocart who really helped shepherd me into the knowledge of biophilic design. Really early on, Sonia invited me to go to a meeting at ASU where William Browning was there from Terrapin Bright Green. And she suggested that he come and see this house because it followed so many principles of biophilic design. So he came to the house and was really excited about what he was seeing in the house, and gave me a paper copy of the 14 Patterns book. And when I started really delving into the 14 Patterns book and looking at it, and I realized that we had just unconsciously had 9 of the 14 patterns ingrained in this design. So that was really exciting for me. And that was the first moment of saying, okay, well, I need to do more research on this. I need to really understand what is the origin of this and how it works, why it works, all of those things.
Given that much of the Cedar Street design revolved around the idea of the Chinese courtyard home Matthew grew up in, I was curious how much nurture imprints on our relationship with nature, and how does that then influence biophilic design?
There's definitely many things that are innate in all human beings from our evolutionary past, and then there's definitely things that people find pleasurable about however they grew up. And sometimes that can be a psychological thing about, less so about nature or whatnot, but things that provide happy memories for you as a child, for instance. I do think there's something to that too. But yeah, biophilic design is much more of a scientific study, I think, in a lot of ways, especially more recently, because once people started delving into what really allows human beings to be more productive and more happy and healthy, there's a snowballing kind of thing going on in neuroscience about really studying all of these different aspects of what we actually need to live happy and healthy lives. Some of that, though, is psychology, too. In the world of design, what we try to do is we look at what we might call a problem, or a site or a problem, or something that needs to be fixed or something that needs to be included in a project, and we aim for that. So design sensibility, pulling the things into a project that appears to be very important or dominant as a necessity always happens. And so it's a matter of, it could be a matter of personal taste or whatnot, or it might be a matter of somebody's chronically ill, and that may require different aspects of biophilic design to help that person. So there's always a reason for pulling in various different patterns in biophilic design. And every site is going to be different too. So sometimes you'll have an advantage of a really great view, let's say, that you really want to take advantage of, and others, if it's in suburbia, you don't get that, and so you turn to other things. Like here, that this house is really based around the ideas of refuge and prospect, which do happen to be two patterns that basically everybody, really understands innately, like why it's beneficial or what it feels like to be in a very comfortable space where you are protected, and you do have a view of natural patterns and whatnot. I mean, you could imagine if you were in a space that, is a concrete jail cell, for instance, with no windows or anything, and you can't even hear the weather outside or the wind, or maybe even worse, you can hear it, but you can't tell what's going on. That's the opposite of biophilic design. You want to be aware. You want to understand what is going on outside, weather-wise and whatnot, so that you can stay safe. Then we all felt, we all have that evolutionary kind of prospect of knowing and wanting to know that kind of information. One of the things that Edward O. Wilson talks about is that by knowing that we have an evolutionary past with nature and that there's all of these innate things that happen in our bodies and our minds based on the environment, and it's something that's really universal in all human beings, it's incredibly important that we actually do find ways to appreciate nature in all of its forms, and everybody needs to do that. When people don't do that, then they shun the environment, or they degrade the environment, or ruin the environment. More than 40% of all of the world's creatures have died, in the last 60 years or something like that. We're losing species really, really quickly. And if we don't save those species and we lose all that we know of as nature, where does that leave us psychologically and physically, where we know that we need nature to provide us with a greater sense of ability and health? So in order to save nature, we have to really get in tune with it.
Naturally, the Cedar Street residence is designed to tune into nature in several ways. The first is through the glass-enclosed courtyard, where they turned the acid-etched side of the glass to the exterior and used the reflective side on the interior. This not only makes the space feel larger, but also creates a mesmerizing movie screen of sorts that shows the ever-evolving patterns and shadows of the surrounding trees, as well as the birds that flit in and out of the courtyard throughout the day. Another is through the tunable shade overhang Matthew designed that allows them to work with the sun to naturally regulate the internal temperature.
When we conceived of the courtyard in this house, one of the things that I felt really strongly about was experimenting with eliminating solar heat gain in one's house all of the year, if you wanted to or needed to. So I did a bunch of calculations trying to figure out, like, how much shade do I really need at different times of the year. Right now the shade is deployed, it is down, and it's about 11'8" of total depth. And what I learned really quickly is that if you have a 2-to-1 proportion, where you have 2 to 1, where the vertical is the 2 and the horizontal is the 1, you can block the 5 hottest months of the year. That solar angle gets cut off, so it won't reach the glass. But in the winter, as we just mentioned, it can get really, really warm in the winter. And so sometimes you don't want any solar heat gain. And the only way to do that is to have a really deep shade. So this shade will definitely knock out all of the sun all year long if you want it that way. But when it's up in the winter, we get sun about halfway through the building. So you're talking about 8 feet of black concrete absorbing all the solar heat gain and then radiating it up. So the shade is really great, and it can stop at any particular point. So I can actually tune the amount of sun that I'm getting in the morning, for instance. What happens in the winter, I've gotten experienced enough with how much solar heat gain I need to keep the building warm. And so in the morning, I look at the overall temperature high, and it might be 56 degrees or something like that. And if that's going to be the high that day, I need a lot of solar heat gain. If it's going to be 65, I don't need very much. And if it's going to be 75, you don't need it at all. So it's really fun to be able to alter this.
Of course, you can't talk about biophilic design without talking about art. Art and nature are arguably two of humanity's most profound connections to the world and to ourselves. Both can nurture empathy, inspire innovation, help us process life's complexities, and call us to tune into something much larger than ourselves.
Art can be an incredibly important aspect to any project. Sometimes you can't have a lot of plants in a building or around a building that can be really useful for people working in a high rise, for instance. So you need to replace that with something. And so there's artists and then there's artisans, right? There's a little, I make a little bit of a distinction. And biophilic design can be done really well by either. The artisans might be something that's turning out something that's easier and faster and more consistent and commercial, where the artists are looking at things and trying to interpret what they're seeing in nature into something that is completely original and potentially, and in some cases very hopefully, made by hand on one level or another. And those, I think those aspects are really important to put into buildings. Now, I also think that there should be art that is not necessarily biophilic, to mix in with, biophilic art, because there are other things that humans need about appreciating how to analyze something that is art, and trying to kind of navigate the world that the artist was in when they were making it. That's not part of biophilic design per se, but it's still something that humans need. We want our brains to constantly be working out a puzzle. It's the same way with nature. I think in that sense, when the people look at a Monet, it has that kind of sense of like, oh my gosh, I can relax looking at this because it's so beautiful and yet mysterious. And there is mystery in biophilic design. There is a pattern of mystery as well. Art is also incredibly important. Like I think it has to, if we don't maintain true artists and enable them to create work that takes a ton of time, that we're going to lose out on a lot of our brain power and a lot of sort of balance in our lives.